My grandfather survived on the Titanic and he told me what really happened during the cruise. I have always idolized my grandfather Pocaros, because he was a very important person in my life. Even in his last years, he could calmly remember conversations that he had 20 years ago. I learned from my mother that he was a passenger on board the Titanic, but he refused to talk about it. I became obsessed with the Titanic story and wanted to make a presentation about it for my school. My grandfather raised his voice at me for the first time in his life after I started begging him to tell me this story. He scolded me. I was scared because I had never seen him behave like that. I went to my bedroom and started crying since I was small and was scared of what had happened. He came into my room and apologized for his behavior. I could see the regret on his face as I pulled away from him. The next morning I went downstairs and saw him sitting at the table with a sad expression on his face. He asked me to sit down, and I reluctantly agreed. There were conflicting emotions on his face when he told me he would tell me what really happened on the Titanic. He made me promise not to tell anyone anything because he was afraid people would think he was crazy. I sat stunned when he started telling the story. I was only 7 years old when I boarded the Titanic. He seemed so gigantic compared to me, and I was amazed at how beautiful everything looked. There were so many people everywhere and they were all so friendly and smiling. I stood on the edge of the ship and waved to the people on the dock as we prepared to sail. It was one of the happiest moments in my life, as I have never felt such joy. My parents took me to my room when we were on the way, as they wanted to enjoy a walk around the ship. I knew we had spent most of our money on tickets since my parents always wanted to live in America. This is the path that the Titanic never went through to the end. On the second day of the cruise, I began to notice the strange behavior of some passengers. They seemed to be coughing heavily and their eyes were very red. My father assured me that it was nothing, but I remember that he himself seemed scared. He left for a few minutes, came back with a wrench and told me it was just for protection. The next morning I woke up to screams coming from the next room. I jumped out of bed and rushed to see what was going on. There was already a group of people standing outside the door. I squeezed through them to see better. I froze, looking at what was in the room. A man lay on the floor with his stomach torn open, and his children were feasting on his entrails. I was pushed aside when the crew members were running into the room. They grabbed these little psychos and tied them up. They looked like rabid animals. We were escorted back to our rooms so they could clean up the mess. I wandered around the ship all day and noticed that many people began to look somehow sickly. I woke up on the fourth day to screams and running around outside the cabin. I looked outside and was shocked that the corridor was covered in blood. I quickly closed the door and went to wake my parents, but they were not in the cabin. I didn't know what to do because I was afraid to leave the room, but I was also afraid to be alone. I spent a couple of hours trying to decide what to do. My screaming stomach finally convinced me that I needed to go out and find some food. Half a day passed and I decided. I crept up to the door, looked out and was relieved to find that the hall was empty. There were distant sounds of rumbling engines and occasional screams. I remembered there was a kitchen down the hall that probably had something I could eat. It took me forever to walk down the hallway, trying not to step on blood or bloody clothes. I got to the kitchen and almost threw up when I saw the corpses inside. They looked like someone had stabbed them 100 times. They were crew members and passengers. I grabbed the food that was at hand and ran away. I ate everything quickly and started searching the ship. In every corridor I came across new corpses. Many of them looked as if their bellies had been ripped off. It was already getting dark, and I began to worry that everyone else on board was dead. I turned the corner and suddenly my bladder was empty when a gun was put to my face. I stood there, trembling with fear, while one of the crew members looked at me for a few moments. He put the gun away and rushed away, leaving me standing alone. It took me a while to collect my thoughts, and by that time it was completely dark. I heard distant gunshots in the direction the crew member was running and wondered who he was shooting at. I was knocked off my feet when the ship was shaken by a deafening roar. I ran to the side and looked at the huge block of ice that we must have crashed into. Ice began to fall on the deck, and I had to move away to avoid being hit. I saw this block moving away from the ship, and I wondered how serious the damage was. I heard a noise behind me, and immediately felt relieved to see his father. I rushed to him, but stopped when I saw that his clothes were covered in blood. His eyes met mine, and I began to tremble, because his gaze was the gaze of an animal, not a human. He let out a guttural growl, and then started running straight at me. But suddenly my father flew back. I turned around and saw that crew member. He was still clutching the gun. He looked at me for a few moments and motioned for me to follow him. He was moving very fast, and I could barely keep up with him. He peeked around every corner, and we passed dozens of corpses. Eventually we reached an area with a large number of survivors. Some tried to lower lifeboats, while others tried to fend off other passengers who seemed to want to eat them. They managed to lower the lifeboats, and they began to slowly evacuate all the survivors. The ship at that moment began to sink slowly, and this sailor was desperately trying to save as many people as possible. Our lifeboat was moving away from the ship, and I saw dozens of passengers rushing back and forth, just attacking each other. The ship began to sink under the waves and most of the people were in the back of the ship. I turned away because I didn't want to see it anymore. The survivors on the boat were sobbing, as none of us could understand what had happened. A few hours later, other ships arrived and rescued us. My mother survived in another lifeboat, and we finally met again with tears in our eyes. The owners of the Titanic offered my mother a substantial sum of money so that she would never say a word, and she agreed. I think most of the survivors would prefer to forget that this ever happened, so everyone accepted this offer. I remember reading the newspapers afterwards and wondering if anyone would find out what really happened. I looked at my grandfather in shock when he finished his story, because I couldn't believe what I had just heard. A tear rolled down his cheek, and then he asked me to swear that I would keep it a secret. That night I went to bed with the intention of asking him more questions in the morning. My mother found him dead the next morning. He had a heart attack last night. I'm posting this now in the hope of finding others whose family members survived the Titanic. I really want to know the full story of what happened. My great-grandmother was on the Titanic. She was from Bristol, from a well-to-do family, but not enough for first class. She didn't like to talk about it, at least that's what my grandmother said. My great-grandmother wrote everything down in her diary while she was on the lifeboat. When the ship went under the water, we heard screams. Not the screams of those poor people freezing in the water around us, but the screams from below. The screams were not full of fear or panic, they were full of rage. My great-grandmother was mentally ill. But now, reading this, I wonder what happened before, the writing of her diary or the moment when she went crazy. Thank you for sharing this story. I'm sorry about your grandfather. Someone extra has appeared on the International Space Station. He's not one of us. I woke up because of some knocking, which stopped a few moments after I opened my eyes. Behind this noise was a familiar rolling rumble, to which I was already accustomed, but the tapping was something disturbing and new, something I had never heard before. The International Space Station was constantly filled with noise, the most noticeable of which was a buzzing hum, reminding you that you are locked inside a powerful vacuum cleaner. The blinds were closed, and darkness permeated every inch of my living space the size of a phone booth. After blinking a few more times, I looked at the luminous dial of my watch and saw that it was still early, not yet 5 in the morning. We worked around the clock, despite the fact that during this time we saw 16 sunrises. If not for the simulated days, we would have gone crazy from the eternal jet lag. Our days started at 6 in the morning and ended at 9 in the evening. Long shifts symbolize the amount of work that needs to be done in a short period of time that each of us had on board the ISS. Our days were divided into 5-minute intervals. Our schedule consisted mainly of experiments and related documentation, meal times, video chats and personal hygiene. Everything was carefully scheduled in 5-minute segments, even our toilet breaks. Closing my eyes, I tried to fall asleep again. My sleeping bag hovered in the air, held by a belt so as not to float away in weightlessness, and so that it would not bump into other people. With 10 crew members on board, neatness was held in high esteem. The space station was built for 6 people, but up to 13 people were on board at the same time, and each person needed a place for food, toiletries and clothes, items that take up precious space. That's why it became obvious to me that someone else got on board the ISS. Someone hiding in the shadows who shouldn't be here. The 11th crew member. I saw him out of the corner of my eye, like a mirage in the desert, and he always disappeared in a second. He was always out of my sight. This thing was very smart and very good at disguising itself. Like an octopus, he merged with the color of the walls and hid in ventilation holes and secret places. It's all hard to believe, I know, but it's true. When I told the team about this, I expected them not to believe me. On the contrary, it seemed that everyone slowly began to notice the same things. Movements in the shadows, rustling and disappearing objects, food and water, clothes and other, more personal things. At first we all thought that there was a kleptomaniac cosmonaut among us who just liked to take other people's things and eat more than he should. But after several crew meetings and weeks of careful observation, it became obvious that this was not the case. None of us stole supplies, we were sure of that. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came again, followed by a knock. Like a creaking pipe that is deformed on a cold night. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I listened to this noise echoing throughout the cabin. He was somehow familiar, but I couldn't figure out why. Getting out of my sleeping bag, I headed towards this sound, floating out of the living node, and began to explore the entire ship. The hygienic and sleeping quarters were quiet, except for the snoring of my colleagues. Knock, knock, knock. The noise was repeated. I tried to be as quiet as possible, turned the corner and swam to the left. I continued to advance through the module of the American laboratory. Flying past expensive equipment and sample containers, I vaguely wondered if the sound was coming from a Japanese laboratory. It seemed to be coming from ahead and to the left, but no one was supposed to be there at that time. Opening the airlock door, I entered the ISS Kibo module, which is a scientific research laboratory in Japan. The Japanese lab was empty, despite the sounds I had just heard from inside. Knock knock knock. The noise came from behind me. I turned around, the rain was coming from my forehead and the drops were floating up like beads. My heart was pounding wildly in my chest. I braced my feet against the walls to push off like a swimmer in a pool. I started swimming back to the entrance of the Kiba. In the ISS, the echo spreads quite bizarrely. I told myself that everything was fine. The noise, whatever it was, came only from the module of the European Columbus Laboratory. That's where it's been coming from all this time. I just didn't take into account the echo. I started swimming in this direction, trying to ignore my naughty nerves. I tried not to listen to the voice in my head that was telling me that there was simply no point in all this. Everything was very strange. What if someone wakes up now? I thought that they might think that I was stealing food and supplies. This is quite possible. I tried to think of something to say if someone noticed me and decided that I would say that I wanted to do sports early. This made sense, since we had to train for 2 hours a day in order not to lose muscles and not spoil bones, and also to prevent fluid from seeping into the subcutaneous layer around the skull. Space snot, that's what we call it. In any case, no matter how it looked from the outside, I needed to figure out what was making that noise and find out if it had anything to do with our mysterious stowaway. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, and instead there was a sound like nails scratching on a blackboard. The screeching was getting louder and louder by the second. The sound came from under me, returning the way I was floating to the residential node. I quickly flew over the second node, where our life support and electrical equipment systems were located. This sound came from outside the station. It was like someone tearing steel with his nails. The screeching echoed through the hull, and I wondered what damage had been done and what could be the cause of such a terrifying sound. Others were already starting to wake up, and I could see the lights coming on in the residential hub as I floated through the air, making my way through the US lab. I decided to look out through the viewing window, trying to figure out what was causing this terrifying sound. I pressed the control button, and the curtain covering the window below me opened. Looking through the glass, I could see the stars and the earth below us. But then something else, much closer. There was one of my teammates frozen in the vacuum of space. His shocked face slid past the window, making a sound like claws scraping on a board. I can't give his name here, so I'll call him David. A black tentacle wrapped around his throat and face. It was as dark as the night sky and floated invisibly into the distance like a huge black squid. This thing was dragging him away from the ship, causing this tapping sound and screeching as his frozen corpse bumped and dragged against the hull of the space station. While I was trying to comprehend what was happening, the black tentacles dug their spikes deeper into his bluish neck, and he began to swim out of sight. A moment later it disappeared like a terrible dream from which I had just woken up and wanted to forget it if I had the opportunity. "What are you looking at there?" the voice of the other end of the American laboratory ahead of me asked. I thought another crew member had woken up from all that noise. And now I had to somehow try to explain what I had just seen. "It's David, him." Tears welled up in my eyes, turning into floating bubbles. I fell silent, not knowing how to continue. Then I looked up and saw the same person who had just died outside, in the freezing vacuum of space. David is right in front of me. He was alive and well and hung in weightlessness like a ghost. "David?" I said. "Yeah, what's wrong with you? And anyway, what was that noise?" "You found our stowaway." The smile on his face told me everything I needed to know. His skin seemed to move and writhe. There were strange bumps on his skin, as if large insects were crawling inside him. But I didn't have time to argue with him, as a few moments later, others began to appear, asking why we got up so early. I shook my head slowly, still not sure if I should believe my eyes. "I heard the sound of tapping," I said. The more I thought about it, the more it all seemed like a dream to me. Was I asleep when I thought I was awake? Is it possible to walk in a dream in space, or rather to levitate? No. I quickly got rid of this feeling. I knew what I saw. "Maybe we should call the center to find out if something has happened," David said. "If you're sure that's what you've heard." "I'm sure." Everyone agreed, and we notified the control center about it. They informed us after a full diagnostic check that all systems were working fine. At night, while we were sleeping, only one strange thing happened. The exit hatch used for our spacewalks was opened by someone, and closed a moment later. I think that would be enough for someone to get in. No one admitted to having opened the hatch. We were all in awkward silence. Oddly enough, but then our problems with supplies were solved. After that, the food stopped disappearing. We had enough for only 10 people again. It was as if an invisible stowaway had suddenly disappeared. Or as if he got rid of someone else and took his place. I can't prove anything, but I'll have to keep a very close eye on David when he gets back to Earth. I'm not sure what else I can do other than keep an eye on him. Whoever he is dangerous and there may be more like him. Who knows, maybe they are already here, among us. There are others living upstairs in our atmosphere, like the one who took David. Imposters, doppelgangers, call them whatever you want. You've all heard of them before. There are a whole bunch of stories about them. I got the impression that all these stories are the same, or rather they are all somehow connected.